Hello, everyone. It's Anthony Fantano, the internet's busiest music nerd. And it is time for another episode of the Needle Drop Podcast. And in this episode that you are about to listen to, we have Mr. Miles Cleret, founder of Soundway Records. We're going to be exploring a little bit of the history and the makeup and the operations of what I feel is one of the most interesting record labels out there, bringing loads of obscure foreign music to a Western audience. So if you want to support this podcast, there are several ways you can do so. You could do what you're doing right now, watch it on YouTube, comment, like, subscribe, share it. You can also hit up our support page, which is linked down there in the description. You can get this episode of the podcast and all up-to-date episodes of the podcast sent straight to your email inbox for a small monthly fee. Also linked down there in the description is our Amazon Associates link. Anything you buy on Amazon, if you live in the US, like some Soundway Records CDs, we get kickback from that, okay? And you can also subscribe to backlogged episodes of this podcast on iTunes. There is a link in the description box for that as well. And I think that's it, guys. That's how you can support this badass podcast. I hope you're having a good one. Enjoy the show. Eat some veggies, drink some water. Let's go. Hey everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd, you know who it is. And it's time for another episode of the Needle Drop Podcast, where we interview artists and content creators from across the internet and the globe. And in this episode, we're having a discussion with Mr. Miles Cleret. He is the founder of Soundway Records, one of the most interesting and eclectic record labels out there on the market at this very moment. They specialize in music that is really outside of the purview of the West, dipping into records and artists and compilations from Ghana, Nigeria, Panama, Colombia, and many more. You can check out the many compilations and original album releases that they have put out lately that feature rock and funk and psych rock and soul music, even high life music from across the world. And we're basically going to be talking in this podcast about the history of the label, the latest releases, the older releases, what exactly makes Soundway Records tick. So Miles, thanks for coming on, man.
Hey, it's good to be here, Anthony.
So give me a bit of a rundown exactly how the record label began and, you know, what was essentially the inspiration behind trying to bring all of this music from other countries to a more Western audience.
Sure, yeah. Well, I started, I guess, from just the need and the want to find obscure records to put into DJ sets and mixes that I was making when I was it was something I've been doing since I was about 14 years old, I guess. So I always used to look in the obscure bins, the international bins, the world music bins at record fairs, trying to find records that were under the radar, not necessarily things that other people were looking for, as well as kind of obscurities within, you know, genres like electronic music and psychedelic rock music, and just sort of kind of join the dots between different musical cultures. I started going to West Africa, and that's how at that point is where the label was born. I spent time in Ghana, especially, and also in Nigeria, looking for the records that didn't really kind of fit into the established genres that people kind of expected from those countries, and records that bands from there were kind of making that were a sort of a fusion of different styles. So trying to find records that would surprise people or just sort of blow people's minds and think, what, really, that came from there? And then that idea, that blueprint was sort of transformed into other countries, and we've ended up doing compilations and reissues from East Africa, West Africa, Asia, South America, the Caribbean. So yeah, that's how it started, really.
And I mean, a lot of the early compilations on the label, you're really kind of pulling back, decades back, into some of the musical histories of these countries, and you stumble across these records when you're visiting them. But, you know, what exactly is the process of trying to ready this music for commercial sale in the West on the Soundway label. I mean, I imagine some of these bands whose music you're kind of reissuing on these compilations aren't even around anymore. You know, how exactly are you getting a hold of some of these artists who have made this music?
Well, it's a long and laborious process. It usually starts by it always starts by, first of all, trying to find the music. So trying to find as many records from, if we're doing a compilation that reflects a country or sometimes a label or a specific kind of period in time, then the first thing is just to try and amass as many of those records or listen to as many of those records from that time or that place as possible. And that's always the hardest thing, because it's amazing, especially when you're looking for the more obscure records, the records that weren't necessarily commercial hits, because quite often these were pressed in tiny numbers, like a couple of hundred or 1,000. And that's the first thing, trying to find the music. Then you have to try and find the artists or the copyright holders. That is also an incredibly hard thing to do. But most of the time, you'll always find the guys that were making the music. The hardest thing is to find the records, and even after 15 years of looking for certain records, they still haven't surfaced. So it's just a piece by piece kind of bit of detective work, really. It's finding the music, finding a clean copy of the music, the tape if possible. If that doesn't exist, a clean record, then the people then finding out who owns the copyright. Sometimes there are disputes amongst the artists about, if you have a band of 6 guys, who wrote the record. There's no information on the label. They didn't put that on every label or every cover in some instances. And sometimes people will squabble. You'll find one guy who's on vocals who claims he wrote the song, and then the dude who played the guitar claims he wrote the song. And a lot of the time it's very easy and straightforward, and a lot easier than a lot of people expect. Most people, 90% of people are just happy you want to do it, and they're cool with it. Sometimes it's a bit more complicated, but yeah, it's just it's detective work, and it's laborious and slow, and it can be tedious at times.
Go into the discovery process a little bit more when you're trying to find music to release on the label. I mean, where exactly are you finding these records? Is it sort of in a dusty old record store like you would over here, or is there something more to it than that?
Well, things have changed a lot in 15 years. I mean, when I started the label nearly 15 years ago, there were still a lot of record stores around in some of these countries, and there was still a direct link to the 70s and the 80s. There were guys who produced music who still were actively sort of kind of, their catalogs were still active in some way. And in 15 years, a lot has changed. A lot of stores have shut down. A lot of guys selling records aren't selling records anymore. A lot of record dealers from Western countries have gone and just bought the whole lot, lock, stock, and barrel up, and are selling them on eBay. The price of records has gone through the roof. A lot of the guys from that era have got a lot older and have stopped, and some of them have passed away. So it has changed a lot. About 15 years ago, and even 10, 7, 8 years ago, like, it was a lot easier to find records. And like you say, in dusty record stores, in market stalls, asking taxi drivers if they know any guys with records in their house, and you'd sort of go to one house and you say, "Oh no, I just threw them out," or "They're in a lockup on the other side of town," and you're back in the car. And in some cities like Lagos in Nigeria, it's like 3.5 hours in a car in traffic to get from one side of town to the other. So a lot of the time is just spent, physically in cars and buses, and just traveling from one place to another, and knocking on doors, and just questioning people about where so and so is. Have you seen that guy? I haven't seen him for 15 years. Oh, I think he lives in that town. Go there. it's just laborious kind of piece by piece picking and piecing the puzzle together. So yeah, it's incredibly what's the word? It's incredibly my jet lag's kicking in. It's a good feeling when you get to the end of some of these wild goose chases, and the guy is there and up for what you're looking for, and has the recordings or the records or the tapes, and is down with what you're doing. So
yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're continually on this, like you said, wild goose chase. It's a scavenger hunt. It's kind of a musical anthropology exercise in a way.
Also, like I say, I mean, 15 years ago, a lot of the guys that I was dealing with in some of these countries didn't have an email address or didn't have a cell phone, and you forget how quick this process of everyone being online all over the world has changed things. Like these days, at the moment, we're doing a compilation. We're doing a compilation of a second compilation from Kenya, Volume 2 of our Kenya special compilation that's coming out later this year. And a lot of those guys are much easier to contact now. Everyone in the world is on some kind of electronic communication device. Whereas 15 years ago that was not the case. It's incredible how much easier these things have become, and also how much more information there is about music. Just the sheer volume of human endeavor that's gone into cataloging music from all over the world that's suddenly up on the internet. It's again, you forget how in the dark we were about certain recording industries and bands and music from around the world only 15 years ago. Some of these records would show up in record fairs in New York or Paris or London, a long way from the countries that they initially started in, and they just be these little kind of snippets of wild exotic information just sitting there with no story or link to where they came from and who the band was. And now so many people have worked so hard to try and piece together all these different scenes and recording catalogs and stories, and so it is a lot easier these days. There's a lot more to go on.
Is it fair to say that technology in some of these countries that you have been bringing music back from, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Panama, has kind of revolutionized the music listening and the music consumption process over there as it has over here?
Yeah, to some extent. I think it's country by country. There's different stories, but yeah, I think there's much more of a especially with younger generations. I think that's something that's changed quite recently. There's been a bigger interest in younger generations in the kind of musical heritage of certain countries. Like I've just been in Indonesia researching a compilation there, and there's now a whole generation of guys in their 20s and 30s who are really interested in the music of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and that just wasn't quite the case like 10 years ago. Most of the people that were listening to that music were the people who had lived it the first time around, and young guys just weren't that interested. It was like their dad's music or their uncle's music or whatever. And so yeah, it has changed in a lot of places. Like one of the guys helping us out with the research and licensing on the Kenya Special Volume 2 record is saying that now in Nairobi there's a vinyl record club that's quite often mostly attended by guys who weren't around in the 70s or even the 80s. So yeah, there's definitely been through technology, like you say, online, through blogs, through this kind of international communication that's come about in the last 10, 15 years, a much more invigorated discussion about old music and musical heritage and how that can influence modern music as well.
But simultaneously, you also describe this time where the record stores themselves aren't doing too well? You know, is the internet kind of having a negative impact on the record stores, or is it just kind of the aging process and just kind of people not being able to keep it up like they used to, that are kind of making some of these, you know, bundles of records that were once in stores, you know, a little harder to find because they're kind of fractured now and all over the place?
Well, it's, you know, sadly, I guess it's to do with price, a lot of that as well. You know, the price of old records of every genre, especially rare old records, it doesn't matter which country they're from, whether from the USA or England or Kenya or Thailand or wherever, has gone through the roof in the last, you know, they've become, you know, almost like artifacts rather than just music. You know, it used to be there used to be a standard price for an LP or a cassette or a CD, and that's changed a lot in the last 10, 15 years as people have started to, more and more people have started to collect things, and the price goes up. So yeah, that's kind of been a sad thing, because like old music is in a lot of places sort of unaffordable unless it's sort of, you know, the rich middle classes or international collectors. And but I suppose the flip side of that is that, you know, not everybody needs to own the thing. You know, the music is out there, and that's kind of what I hope to do with our stuff, is just to make it available. It's whether that's on a streaming platform, or if you want to download it from, you know, all the digital stores out there, or if you want to own the reissue on vinyl and pay a little bit more and stick it on the shelf. So, you know, there's a variety of different ways to hear the music, and hopefully that, you know, even people that download it for nothing and don't pay anything, you know, at least some of these guys are hearing it, and a lot of the time they're musicians who are incorporating those ideas into new music. And you know, hey, if they can't afford it, they can't afford it, you know. The most important thing is that music continues to, the whole story of music evolving and fertilizing other different areas around the world is the most important thing to me. And I think if you speak to a lot of musicians, hey, they don't like to get to lose money. They don't like it that their royalty checks are going down because people aren't buying music. But if you really get to the bottom of things with most musicians and ask what it is they're in this for, it's to get their music out there. It's for people to hear it. It's to express themselves. So, you know, as long as that's happening, then it's a good thing.
There are a couple things I want to go off of what you just said. So one of them is more of a tunnel that we're going to have to go down, you know, in the midst of this interview. But the first question I want to ask you, and this is just kind of a quick aside, just reflecting off of everything you just said, you know, there's certainly a widespread conversation going on now amongst music writers and music fans. You know, especially when it deals with music in the West, this whole idea of cultural appropriation and just that being a very negative thing. And, you know, you're here kind of openly discussing the idea of this, but you're kind of talking about it on this international level. And, you know, what's your opinion basically of, you know, kind of painting this idea of a Western musician directly taking influence from, you know, one of these obscure gems that you've unearthed from Ghana, for example, and sort of incorporating that directly into their music? You know, is that essentially this really horrible cultural appropriation thing, you know, where you're kind of stealing in a way?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you know, we could have an hours-long conversation about cultural appropriation, and it's obviously a very thorny issue in certain ways. I mean, it works both ways, though. Like, you know, do you say that a band who wanted to do Beatles covers or was influenced by Elvis Presley, who happened to come from Indonesia or Nigeria, is also culturally appropriating something? Is that banned too? Is that not allowed? Is Cuban music that made it back to Senegal in the 60s and 70s, is that cultural appropriation? I mean, you know, it's more obvious and more apparent when it's the West. You know, the Western band ripping off or incorporating elements of music from countries that have often been subjugated or colonialized by Western countries, and so it's still a prickly subject. I think there's ways to do it. I think, sometimes there are cheesy, corny ways of doing it, and you're like, oh, that's not cool. And then there are subtle ways to do it, and we live in 2016. I do believe this conversation is one that's going to be more and more and more watered down as we evolve and move around and culturally mix with each other, and that happens at different rates in different places. Places like London or New York. It's almost the norm that's what happens. We have bands on our label that are based here in London that literally every different band member is from a different country of the world. And they're based here doing their thing, and they're soaking up all the different influences of the places and the cultures, of the strands of their lives from which they come, in a place that's inhabited by people from all over the world. And so, like I say, that's just going to become the norm all over the planet. And I think eventually it can be a positive thing. There's always going to be some haters out there and people that get it cross with it. And like I say, I can understand it when it's done in a crass way. But I do think that, music mixing and fusing has always happened. It's the story of modern music. Show me a kind of music that is culturally, especially modern music, that is culturally kind of independent of everything else.
Sure, culturally isolated in some kind of way.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. We're human beings. We've always talked to each other culturally, and we've always exchanged ideas, language. You name it. That's not going to stop.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of I fully agree with you. There's so many. It just seems like such a one-dimensional way to kind of paint the whole idea of cultures kind of influencing one another to make certain kinds of art. Because while there are Western acts over here that take quite a bit of influence from foreign styles of music, I'm sure that you've seen firsthand the incredible amount of influence that American music, that British music has on countries all over the world.
Yeah, and American music and British music in its own way was influenced. I mean, the whole kind of explosion of British bands in the 60s. Those bands in their own way were taking Black American music and reinventing it, and then that Black American music was coming from, where was it coming from? It was coming from New Orleans or West Africa or the Caribbean, and this is a story you can keep tracing this back and back and back. It doesn't stop. It's again, I've been researching this compilation from Indonesia. It's a fascinating place. It's been a place that's soaked up different cultures for millennia. There's an Arabic influence through religion and trade. There's an Indian influence through like Bollywood films that came in the 50s. There's a Cuban influence through the Cuban records that were allowed by the communist country to be there when they were trying to suppress rock and roll. And then there's the rock and roll influence that they were trying to suppress but couldn't, because when you try and repress something, what do the kids want to do? They want to listen to it more. So there's all these different threads, and it's ever been thus.
Yeah, it's to sort of just paint it in that one single way. Sort of Western musicians and artists kind of stealing from other places, it sort of discounts all the other ways that music can influence other cultures across the world. Just like specifically in, like you were just saying, in Indonesia, which is a pretty, which is actually a story I'm sure that we could do an entire podcast on if need be.
Yeah,
because I mean that sounds pretty crazy. All of those different kind of bits of art and culture were kind of culminating in that one country in those particular ways.
Well, one thing that's always interesting to me is just how many of the music scenes that we've concentrated on or looked at have been port towns, like, you know, towns that, if you think about it, like, you know, some of the big centers of music in Africa or the Caribbean or Latin America or Asia are port towns. This is how music
absolutely.
travels.
All the travel, all the shipping.
Yeah, the sailors coming off ships, they come into town, they want a good time, they go to the hotel, the club, that's where the musicians come. The musicians are doing the same routes, and that's how the songs and the rhythms and the arrangements travel, and the music and the instruments quite often as well. You know, you have waves of different instruments, from, you know, kind of Spanish guitars through to stringed instruments, and then brass instruments in the jazz age, and then electrified guitars in the late 50s and 60s, and then guitar amps in the 70s, and then the 80s synthesizers and keyboards, you know, and that's how music is spread, those channels, you know. And it's amazing, you know, from Havana to New Orleans to Lagos to Accra to Port of Spain to Panama City to you know, Bombay. You know, these are port towns. This is how the music travels.
All right, the other road that I want to go down now, that we're kind of stepping away from that cultural appropriation thing, that question's been kind of explored as far as I'd like to, is once you have found the music, you know, you've got everything squared away to release it, and you know what the compilation is going to be, you know what the collection of songs is going to be. What exactly is the dissemination process after that? You know, who is the intended audience for this music, and how exactly are you sort of reaching out to them? You know, because I guess the next hurdle to kind of get over is not just putting out the music, but actually kind of convincing an audience of people to give something a try that they didn't even know existed in the first place.
Well, I think quite plainly and simply, from my point of view, if it's me compiling something, and if I'm working with other compilers, it's just a case of boiling down the quite often thousands, hundreds and thousands of records into 20 or 30 that just stand out, and quite often records that appeal not just to, you know, if I make a compilation of music from Panama, I'm not just trying to appeal to a Panamanian audience. Like, and if a Panamanian guy was to put that record together, would probably choose records that were slightly different, because there would be more of a, you know, an insider's opinion on what should be in that condensed sort of collection. So it's really nothing more sort of complicated than, right, what are the best tracks? And if it's these days, quite often I'm compiling with 2 or 3 other people, and it's just a case of sending lots and lots of files between each other and going, no, I don't think that one, and just boiling it down. Quite often it's to do with production qualities, or just, you know, something that just like is so completely outside of the usual generic boundaries. Like, a record will come along and everyone will be like, wow, where did that one come from? How did listen to the way they recorded the guitar on that, or listen to how they recorded the keyboards on that. Like, where did that come from? Sometimes the obscurity, but the obscurity never trumps musical quality. So yeah, and it's trying to also within, you know, like this Kenyan compilation that we're putting together. You know, Kenya is a country with many different musical cultures and tribal linguistic boundaries within that country, and then it has countries around it, bands from countries around it that came into Kenya to work within the music industry and live within Kenya. So you have Tanzanian bands and Congolese bands also working within Kenya. So you have, like, in that country, like 10 or 20 very distinct musical cultures, and so you're trying to represent them all in 1 or 2 compilations, but trying to pick music that sits together well. That so there's a story, a narrative between how these tracks have influenced each other, and how the different languages and tribal areas and cultural areas have influenced each other. And yeah, at the end of the day, just the best pieces of music as well.
But once that's all kind of assembled, how exactly, are you guys eliciting a reaction from the audiences that you're looking to reach, though? Because I guess from my point of view, and this isn't the case for me personally, because I do enjoy a lot of records off of your discography, but when trying to say, hey, you got to check this out, I sort of, run into this issue where it seems like a lot of the time people associate with music on a cultural level, where they enjoy music that sort of feels familiar to them, not only in terms of stuff that they've heard before, but I guess a song or an artist that they identify with in a way. It's like, oh, this artist or this music is from where I'm from, and trying out music from another country can feel so alien to some people, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that's something that I guess to a certain degree you just have to leave to the audience. Some things can be too out there for certain people, or too far away from their comfort zone, I guess. When we first put the compilations together from Thailand, we had a lot of fans of the West African compilations.
I remember that comp. That was really a change of pace for you guys.
Yeah, and some of the compilations from South America as well. We had fans who had come from that whole kind of jazz, funk, hip hop sort of experience, I suppose. A lot of people who had sort of grown up in the sort of early 90s hip hop scene, who had been into rare groove, jazz, funk as well, and that kind of that kind of culture, who'd been totally on board with the West African stuff because it's close in a way. It's got sort of funk elements, jazz elements, the arrangements are quite jazz.
There's something familiar about
it. Yeah,
and
there's something familiar, and then with the Thai stuff, it's like, whoa, this is different, and like I'm not sure if I can get down with those vocals. They're too kind of alien to me. So yeah, you kind of, it's down to the audience. Some people got them and some people didn't, and then actually a lot of hip hop producers were really into those records. In fact, there's a sample from one of those Thai compilation. There's a couple of samples, but like Dre sampled one of those tracks on his last album.
Really?
Yeah. And there's an Argentinian hip hop band that have just sampled one of them. The guy from what was that project? Not the Black Seeds. It's the guy from the Black Seeds. The one with the what's the record called? Can't remember the name of the record now. It's, came out last year. It was what's he called? Dan Auerbach.
Oh, okay. Yeah, from the Black Keys.
Yeah, what's the record he put out last year? Under a different guise. Anyway,
was it like his solo band that he just dropped a record with?
Yeah. Anyway, they sampled the a track from the Thai compilation as well. So even at first when we didn't, when we put those compilations out, and I worked with a Thai guy from Bangkok who was helping us on that, and he has a record store and a record label and a band out of Bangkok. We weren't sure who the audience would be. There was a little scene of kind of guys in Bangkok, and Chris Menist, who's a co-compiler, had been putting on these sort of events where he played Asian music in London. But yeah, so you take a kind of leap of faith, thinking, well, I think this music is good and deserves a platform internationally to be heard. And after that, it's down to the audience as to how far they want to go with different kinds of music, I guess. And I do believe that people are way more receptive and open-minded musically all across the world. I think, especially younger generations these days compared to when I was a teenager in the late 80s, early 90s. I think the generations these days are much more musically evolved and mature in a way that we kind of weren't, and the boundaries are much more blurred.
Yeah, most certainly with the internet, with the ability to just kind of listen to anything at the tip of your fingers on the internet, there doesn't necessarily need to be a cultural in or an appeal to actually get you to try a song out, if it's just clickable like any other song on the internet.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, do you like it? That's the
sure
thing. And that's the thing. A lot of these, again, a lot of the countries we go to, you'll find people that can sing and recite whole songs in a different language to the one that they were brought up speaking, but a language that happens to come from the same country in which they were born. But because these tracks are hits within their country, because they're kind of multicultural countries like Indonesia and Kenya and Nigeria have multiple different language groups, and so you have a hit that people will know even though that they don't understand the lyrics. And we find that in the West kind of a bit unusual, especially the Anglophone West, like the US or the UK, where we're so kind of the music we hear on a day-to-day basis is all in English. But
with the exception of Gangnam Style.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, the world's biggest, in brackets, world music hit.
But it's moments like that actually makes me think like, wow, like if somebody were, it's moments like that makes me think there is certainly potential for a foreign artist to make a hit over here that isn't necessarily a novelty song,
No, exactly. And if you talk to people in France, they laugh at us because French people have and other European countries as well, like they have amazing radio stations that play. They're much more used to it. They have this kind of multilingual kind of way of listening to music that we don't have in the UK and the US. We're kind of it's just a different way of listening to music.
Sure, no, absolutely. So what is next, sort of on the docket in terms of countries that you're looking to visit again, to sort of dig up more musical obscurities, and are they countries that you visited before when looking for music for the record label, and if so, what kind of keeps you going back to some of these places?
The label these days has sort of two sides to it. So we still doing compilations of music from generations past, but we also have the contemporary side of things where we're putting out.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that too a little bit later. Some of the newer artists that you guys are working with.
So that's one kind of difference between the label. But at the moment, we're just putting together, like I said, the second compilation of Kenya Special. I'm going back to Nigeria with a compilation of kind of disco and boogie from the 80s. So that's a country that I've spent a lot of time in historically. I haven't been to for a while, but I work with a Nigerian researcher, blogger, DJ, music lover called Uchenna Ikone, who's based up in Massachusetts, but of Nigerian heritage. So he's helping on that side of things. Like I say, I've been spending quite a lot of time in Indonesia working on this compilation of music from the late 1950s and early 60s. So I don't know. I go where things take me. It's as the label has got bigger. And has more day-to-day stuff to run. As I've got older, I've got children now. It becomes a little harder to travel, and so we kind of have a sort of a range of different people involved in the label these days as well. Like, so, in the early days of Soundway, quite often the compilations were just kind of me alone, and it was like a sort of hobby thing and a small label that I ran from home. And these days there's much more. There are many more people involved, and people pitch us compilations, and they take years, some of these compilations. I mean, you know, some of them take 3-4 years. You know, somebody might come with an idea and go, oh, I'm working on that, and I've got this idea for this compilation from here, but you know, how do we do it? And it's a long, painstaking process sometimes. Like, there's a couple of compilations I'm working on now that you know, we've only just started, and also there's a lot more competition these days as well. You know, it's become easier to sort of self-distribute and self-promote record labels, which I think is a fantastic thing. You know, I think there's so much music out there that, you know, the more people that do this kind of thing, the better. I think possibly the market can get saturated to a degree, which will remain to be seen. But yeah, it seems like there's an incredible hunger and desire for so many different kinds of music from all over the world. And, you know, we're already moving into people doing compilations of music from 15 years ago when I started the label, you know. And, you know, 90s music and music from the early 2000s. And I'm sure there's tons of music being made now that will die a pretty quick death, or it won't get heard properly, and in 20 years' time people will be doing compilations of it from everywhere.
Yeah, all that stuff from the 90s and 2000s that to you or I probably doesn't seem that far away is now slowly getting older and older.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and now we've got this whole kind of, you know, the ease with which people can make music digitally. It doesn't even make it onto a tape or a vinyl record or a CD. It's just, you know, people will be digging through hard drives in 20 years' time.
Yeah, people will just be trading obscure MP3s at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you know.
Okay, so tell me a little bit now about the more contemporary side of the label, because I know that you guys have been ramping up with a lot of newer original releases from a lot of up-and-coming artists. You know, it seems like you guys have kind of built the record label on, you know, sort of this one idea of obscuring of unearthing all of these obscure gems from across the world. But now you're kind of using the fan base you've built to put on some other artists who, you know, are maybe either a little pre-established, or, you know, you're kind of giving them a home that they wouldn't have had otherwise on the label.
Yeah, well, I mean, for starters, I think that personally, I think right now is one of the most exciting times in music because of a lot of what we've spoken about so far. I think that the musicians are so musically mature and aware because of all this, you know, all this movement of music and the consumption of music. And so I think there's just so many great bands out there at the moment that I got to a point where I started hearing records that were, you know, brand new recordings that I was like, I really should be putting some of this stuff out. And I had a realization that a lot of the bands that were on our compilations, or a lot of the recordings that were on our compilations, quite often, especially in terms of the kind of more progressive African music, were, and some of the more obscure recordings from all over the world were sort of only there because producers had taken a chance and put out records that they, you know, that otherwise would never have been recorded. And for posterity and for, you know, the continuation of this sort of story of music evolving, I just sort of realized that I really wanted to start putting out contemporary music as well, alongside the older stuff. I also kind of came out of a period of just looking and digging and playing and DJing music from a very specific kind of era, and sort of felt that I wanted to start listening to more contemporary music. I'd always listened to all different kinds of music my whole sort of teenage years and 20s, and then sort of went into this kind of wormhole of 1970s tropical music and came out thinking, yeah, you know, I'd like to start listening to to expanding my horizons. And so and also people were starting to send me amazing demos and recordings that I just thought, I'd like to do this and move the label into it. Now that we have a kind of audience and we have people's ears, it would be almost it would always be a missed opportunity not to start hitting them with other stuff and to pushing them into slightly different directions, and especially when some of the bands have kind of specifically told me that they've been influenced by the compilations that we've been put out.
Absolutely. You guys have been dropping compilations for so long that there have to be artists out there making new music that are taking inspiration from it.
Yeah, so to me, it's a pretty logical progression, and it's certainly tougher in some ways. Some records are a lot tougher, and unless a band can tour and get into certain markets or get out of their home market, it's hard to sell records as internationally as something like a compilation of classic 60s and 70s recordings. But other bands like, for instance, Ondatrópica, that record, the Ondatrópica record, that's the best-selling record on Soundway, period. Like, it's outsold all of our compilations, and is a contemporary record. It has its feet firmly in a specific era, but it is a contemporary record. And so it's for me, it's as a record label, it's a natural progression, and the two sit side by side quite well. They're different beasts in terms of how you go about trying to market them and promote them. But
just to kind of get into a few of these groups that you guys are contemporary groups that you guys are releasing music with. Namely a group like Meridian Brothers. I mean, they're a group that, like Ondatrópica, their feet are placed firmly within a certain type of music that comes from a certain era, but it doesn't really just have the contemporary vibe to it like the Ondatrópica record does. It's also, in a lot of ways, kind of wildly experimental.
Yeah. Well, they're a unique band. They sound like no one else, and I'm pretty sure no one else will ever sound like them. And so, when I get sent something like that, I'm like, how can I not put this out? It's, even if only, and when sometimes you get records and you think, is there a market for this? Is there an audience for this? But, they're a great case in point. When I first signed them and I put their first record out, I was a little bit kind of, I know these guys are great live, and they have a live scene in Bogota, and they have, but they've totally exceeded expectations. People love the fact that they're so out there and so wild and so experimental. And
I mean, it sounds like one of the stranger obscurities that would make it on one of your compilations, except it's happening now.
It's happening now, exactly. Yeah. And if those records hadn't been put out, I think the world would be a slightly less musically rich place. And that's the case for every record that everybody puts out, but these days it's very easy for things to disappear onto just by getting put out on digital formats or something. And so to actually be able to put things out on vinyl and know that they'll be there physically forever is a great feeling.
And another group I definitely want to mention before I ask you a couple more questions about Ondatrópica is this other group. Tell me if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Fumaça Preta?
Fumaça Preta, yeah.
Fumaça Preta. Okay, they're like this wild Latin psych rock group, and the recordings are pretty crazy.
Yeah. I mean, they're just they're a band that. Like you say, they started off being very sort of influenced by psychedelic rock from Brazil. The first record had a guy called Joel Stones on vocals, who is a Brazilian guy that runs a record store in the USA, plus a guy called Alex Figueira, who's from Venezuela, on drums, and a couple of English guys on bass and guitar, who have been in funk bands for 20 years. So they're a very diverse band who kind of reflect what I'm talking about, really. Lots of different strands and elements, but they've come together to make something that on first listens it sort of sounds kind of, yeah, right, okay, I can hear some of those influences of 1970s psychedelic rock, but then in other areas they're doing, they're like mixing Funana drums from Cabo Verde, or like 808 sort of, or 303 acids kind of squelchy stuff that from a sort of acid house influence. And so all these different influences, and then recorded in a very sort of DIY garage rock style in Alex's studio in Amsterdam. And they're an amazing live band. Yeah, they're just total kind of punk rockers who happen to sing in Portuguese and Spanish, but who listen to all kinds of music. And that's very much kind of the raison d'etre of the contemporary sort of side of Soundway, I guess. Sort of this sort of mixed up, from all over the place. Another of our bands is Bibio Sound Machine, who are like a kind of they're a band based in London. The lead singer, Eno Williams, is of Nigerian heritage, but brought up here. Her native tongue is a language called Ibibio from Nigeria. So she's on vocals. Then there's a guy called Alfred Bannerman, who's a Ghanaian guitarist who I'd worked with on some of the old Ghanaian material that we'd reissued. The percussionist is from Brazil. The drummer has Trinidadian roots. The horns guys are from England and Australia. Then there's another band called Family Atlantica, who, like, the lead singer is Venezuelan. There's guys from Ghana, Nigeria, all different. This is kind of the world that we live in if you grow up in a Western city in 2016, and that's kind of these records just reflect our culture.
All right, and to end things off, can you tell us much information about this upcoming Ondatrópica record? A lot of people listening to this podcast and watching this YouTube channel should be familiar with their debut album and the project, because I did give it such a glowing review when it came out. It was one of my favorite albums of that year when it dropped. It's definitely my favorite of the contemporary releases that you guys have put out.
Yeah.
What's going on with the latest record? I know they did an Indiegogo campaign that was semi-successful.
Well, firstly, Will and Mario had raised some of the money to do the recording down in Colombia. Firstly, thank you to everybody who helped those guys get their money, and don't worry, your records will be coming soon, and you will be at the front of the queue. Believe me, we've just been talking about that this weekend with Will Quantic. The record is a slight. It's very much an Ondatrópica record, but it's a slight change of direction in that. Whereas the first one was a very ambitious project with 44 musicians that was funded by the British Council and recorded at Discos Fuentes, the kind of legendary studio in Medellin in Colombia. This one was recorded in Bogota and in the islands of Providencia. Now, the islands of Providencia are a group of islands quite a long way off the coast of Colombia that are politically and owned by Colombia, but the culture there is very different in that it's English speaking, and it is almost close. It's kind of has more in common with Jamaica and Trinidad in that it has a kind of calypso and kind of reggae soca kind of element. It's more because of the the English speaking nature of the islands. It's more related to those cultures. So this record has a dual side to it. It has the half of the record recorded in Bogota that is kind of classically Ondatrópica and related to all the sort of the more Latin-esque cumbia and Pacifico music styles from Colombia, and then it has this kind of calypso, reggae island side to it as well. So a lot of the musicians from the Colombian mainland went over, and then they recorded with some vocalists and musicians there. So it's a great record. It's been a while coming, but it's all mixed and ready to go. It's going to be out at the end of January next year, and I don't think people are going to be disappointed. It's beautifully mixed. It's got that kind of depth of sound, and it's a fantastic record. So we're working hard on that at the moment, just getting the artwork together and the videos and planning tours in North America and Europe. And there's also going to be a whole, they've also made a whole dub album of versions of some of the tracks as well, which we're going to be following up with later in the year, next year. So yeah, we'll be releasing kind of more information about it as the year goes on. Watch this space.
Okay, great, man. I want to thank my guest, Miles Cleret of Soundway Records, for coming on and talking about his record label and his experiences and releasing music from all over the world. I appreciate you taking the time, man.
No worries, Anthony. It was a pleasure.